I volunteered to preach this service because I really love the story of Thomas. I relate to the story of doubting Thomas. I'm a questioner and a doubter. Plus, I've been in enough associate ministry and pulpit supply positions to have been asked to preach on Thomas before, because all your pastors deserve a break the Sunday after Easter. So it did feel a little bit like cheating to offer to preach this particular sermon. But you will perhaps be happy to know that as soon as I dove into today's story, I found the Spirit leading me in an entirely different direction that I've ever taken with it. So it turns out I had to work for it after all. The shift for me started with the words locked room, which sound an awful lot like lock down, which feels a little close to home. Suddenly, I was more in tune with the charged atmosphere of that locked upper room than I was with abstracted, rational ideas about cognitive assent. What I realized in a new way this time is that this story is a story of trauma. The disciples have experienced a horrifying spectacle of brutality and torture and terror. Their entire worlds have been flipped upside down and inside out, and they are overwhelmed with anxiety and fear and grief. And in that state, they are hunkered down together, locked in a room in shock. Now, trying to process an additional shocking experience. Theologian Shelley Rambo works at the intersections of trauma and theology. And she reports that when we are experiencing trauma, our brains respond by shifting from our hippocampus, or our thinking center, into our limbic system, or if you've ever worked with children on emotional intelligence, our reptile brain. Meaning, when our brains are signaling danger, they immediately shift away from words to our bodies, from cognition to the somatic. As we also know from post-traumatic studies, this trauma persists in our bodies long after the traumatic event, often far below the surface. For people post-trauma, the past keeps intruding on the present, and our brains keep telling our bodies that they're in danger. And because this trauma is lodged in our bodies and in our senses, it can't be processed and healed through thinking or through talking it out. Instead, we have to engage our senses and learn to use them in new ways as we witness difficult truths that will integrate that suffering into the present. And that is what brings healing. And Rambo points out that this story of the trauma and the healing in the upper room is a story situated in the limbic system, beyond the reach of our cognitive processes. So it turns out it's less about the doubts in our heads and more about healing and hope in our bodies. When Rambo delivered a series of lectures on this topic 3 years ago, she observed that given the realities of racialized violence and the Me Too movement, our entire culture is living in its limbic system. And I would hazard a guess that as we reflect on a year of anxiety and grief and communal lockdown, with continued attention to racialized violence, we are even more so locked into our collective limbic system. And like the disciples, we are also now adding a layer of hope, of new life, of resurrection, of post-trauma to our experiences of trauma these past years. So what, then, does this story teach us about the resurrected Jesus and how he brings healing and new life? First, when Jesus repeats, "Peace be with you," throughout both encounters in the upper room, it's not the light, but no doubt sincere, "Peace be with you" that we share during our passings of the peace. This peace be with you is an acknowledgement of the profound anxiety and grief in that room. It's Jesus' recognition that the hippocampus is offline and the limbic system is in control in this space. And so Jesus bypasses words and engages the senses. He shows the disciples the marks of crucifixion. And while they are joy-filled in their frontal lobes, are taking in this newly present Jesus, the confusion and the trauma clearly remain because Jesus has to say it again. "Peace be with you." Trauma doesn't evaporate when the danger passes. Their limbic systems haven't fully taken in this new truth. And so, Jesus breathes on them. All trauma and mindfulness work centers the role of the breath in grounding and healing. Our breath is what directs and regulates the limbic system. It is powerful and it is sacred in every world religion. And so, in breathing on them and connecting them to spirit or breath, as he says, "Peace be with you," Jesus is reorienting these traumatized disciples through their senses to a new reality, a new truth. And of course, Thomas misses that first healing moment in the locked upper room. His response, which we have interpreted as being about the frontal lobe, probably because that's our cultural comfort zone, is actually one that is fully carnal. The Greek word Thomas uses for touch is intense. The best interpretation being to plunge his finger into Jesus' wound. He somehow knows that he has to engage his senses. And so, when Jesus reappears in that limbic-laced room, he again acknowledges it with his comforting, "Peace be with you." And then he invites Thomas to use his sense of touch to integrate this new reality into his own body and to begin to heal from the trauma of Jesus' death. And here's what else I love about this story that we often miss. Jesus' wounds remain on his body post-resurrection. They're not there only as a way to function for us to recognize Jesus. They remain because trauma leaves wounds, sometimes visible, more often invisible, like the iceberg where most of its mass actually lies beneath the surface of the water. We have a tendency to rush healing and recovery, to push for progress, to celebrate bodies that are pure, perfect, whole. But that's not the gospel. The gospel says that bodies with wounds and scars are beautiful and fully alive, that we can joyfully celebrate new life and resurrection while we are still doing the embodied work of healing. This is good news, even as it's a challenge. While there can be danger in universalizing trauma, there is no doubt that almost all of us have experienced trauma in this pandemic, whether from death or disability, from isolation or crushing care work, from disillusionment or frustration, from milestones and sports and special trips missed. Our bodies have lived with tension and uncertainty and grief and anxiety for a year now. Our limbic systems have been in overdrive for an extended period of time. And what we know, particularly from bodies who have experienced the traumas of oppression for lifetimes and generations, is that our bodies remember. Our bodies keep the score. We get sick or weepy or irritable on the anniversary of a loss or a trauma, even if the date has escaped our conscious thought. And we ignore our embodied trauma to our own peril because it will have its way implicitly with our health if we do not deal with it intentionally. As we live into this 1-year anniversary of the pandemic, as we begin to think about taking steps away from lockdown, as we attempt to reckon with systemic racism and all forms of oppression, as we face any of our individual traumas, and as we begin to have hope, we need to acknowledge that our wounds remain. We have to get comfortable communally and individually with the discomfort of engaging our senses, of feeling our feelings, of experiencing new realities, of integrating our wounds into new narratives. And the good news is that we have the resurrected Jesus with us, breathing on us and with us, and telling us as many times as we need to hear it until we feel it in our bones. Peace be with you. And when he says, "Blessed are those who believe," it's important to know that even here it's not about cognition. The Greek word for belief is a verb. Faithing is a better pre-Enlightenment translation. The idea being that we are blessed when we keep living into our hope of life and love and healing that is rooted in our experience of a God who understands what it means to be embodied, who knows what it means to experience trauma, to bear the wounds, and to keep breathing as new life emerges. May God bless you. May God bless us as we do this sacred work together. Amen.